the first of many practice clinics, okay? And our objective for today is to internalize lesson plans, all right? So we're gonna be working on this over the course of the next few weeks until it becomes second nature for us, okay? So I wanna start out just by celebrating you all. As we walked through the building yesterday, we did see that students were doing exactly as you guys were asking them to do. They were following directions because you guys have done the work to set clear routines and procedures and really model your expectations for your scholars. So I really commend you guys for setting that strong foundation. And we also saw that you were utilizing the curriculum resources. So what we'll talk about today is the other side of that, because we did also notice that pacing was off yesterday. We did also notice that there were parts of the lesson plan that were skipped or either taught incorrectly. And in doing so, the students didn't get the intended meaning behind the lesson. So we want to make sure that we are giving students exactly what the curriculum resources are offering them. We want to make sure that we are meeting the rigor of the lesson. Because here at Hollister, we will maximize instructional time, and we will deliver high quality instruction for our scholars that is standard aligned. We will prepare our scholars better and faster. So today, in order to do that, we gotta learn how to internalize our lesson plans. And that's what we're gonna work on today, okay? So today, we're gonna practice how to internalize lesson 9 from the grade 4 Arts and Letters curriculum resource so that we can maximize our instructional time and meet the rigor of the standard. So as I model, notice what I do to get clear on the purpose of the lesson, the structure and pacing, the exact questions that I ask, and the parts that I need to rehearse in advance. So I have here a little cheat sheet for you guys. Before we go further, I want to explain to you what you guys have on your desk. So I'm displaying the internalization lesson plan. It's really those 4 steps that I just said. So we're looking at what we do before we start planning for our lesson. So that part is setting the purpose. Then we're looking at the structure and pacing of the lesson. Then we're looking at the actions and what you're saying throughout the lesson. And then we're looking at any parts that might be tricky throughout the lesson that we might need to rehearse before delivering it to scholars. So you have that 4-step process in an internalization document that's on your desk. I also have printed and provided an excerpt from the unpacking document because that leads our learning and the purpose of the lesson. And then you guys have a printed copy of lesson 9, which is what is going to be our focus for today. So all of those materials along with the actual student book, we're going to be using for this practice clinic. So first I'm going to start out by modeling how I would internalize a lesson, okay? So just like we do and we've worked on when we start math lesson planning, where we're trying to set the purpose for the lesson, we're looking at lesson targets and goals. We're really starting with the beginning with the end in mind. We're going to do that same process when we're planning our arts and letters lessons, okay? So the first thing that we will do, and those materials are near yours, so feel free to write on them. And I thank you guys for doing like we said, kids don't touch them until I tell you to do so. You now can highlight and make notes if you guys would like, okay? They're yours now. So thank you for asking, Ms. Rogers. So going back, before I teach, I know that I have to have a clear understanding of what my scholars need to know and show by the end of the lesson. So again, we're beginning with the end in mind. So Arts and Letters has that already set up for you. The first thing we need to do is look at the preview page of your manual. So we have here lesson 9. I'm going to go through each part of the preview page. So I see we have the essential question, which is, what does having a great heart mean? We have the content framing question. I see that this is a reveal lesson. And the content framing question is, what does a deeper look at figurative language reveal? For the overview, I have a preview of the lesson, and it states, in this reveal lesson, students use figurative language to understand complex information in the circulatory story. Examining metaphors and similes helps students visualize the heart's role in the circulatory system. During writing instruction, students review the organizational structure of the writing model for Module 1 and learn how its structure is supported by the painted essay. This work prepares students for informative essay writing tasks throughout Module 1. The learning goals are to the right. The learning goals are to analyze the use of similes and metaphors in the circulatory story. The learning target is to explain how a metaphor helps readers understand the function of vowels. Analyze the structure of the painted essay. The learning target is to explain how the painted essay supports the organization of the writing model for Module 1. There are 3 vocabulary words for this lesson, and they are metaphor, simile, and vowel. Now, the purpose of reading through this preview page was really to get the goals for the lesson. So as I go through, and you'll see highlighted on your page, I picked out keywords that hinted to those goals. So even though it tells me the learning goals there on the right specifically, I'm still looking at that preview to see exactly how it connects in the lesson. Because when we look in a second at unpacking that standard, it'll make a little more sense why we need to look at that preview part, okay? So as I looked through the preview part and I read through, the things that jumped out to me were use figurative language, but also why we're using the figurative language, or the author is using figurative language. The author is using figurative language to understand complex information in the circulatory story. So examining metaphors and similes stood out to me, but also the purpose. We're examining metaphors and similes to help students visualize the heart's role in the circulatory system. Reviewing the organizational structure stood out to me, but why are we doing that? The purpose is what?
To learn how the structure is supported by that painted essay.
Very good. So we're connecting how the organizational structure supports the structure of the essay. So that is going to connect to our unpacking document. Yes, ma'am.
It also gets the kids ready for the informative essay writing skills they're gonna need.
That's right. Okay, so it does also connect to later lessons, and it gives them, and you'll also see that at the end of this lesson too.
Yes.
Okay, so as you're talking through, you will be talking through with the students to let them know what this is preparing them for. That's a very good point. All right.
So would you talk this through with the students? You would?
So this part is explaining the learning goals. And yes, you start your lessons by explaining your lesson goals.
Oh.
The good thing though is that as you go through the lesson, which we'll see in a few minutes, you will see in the lesson where it already tells you to say that to the students and when to say it at what part in your lesson, okay? So that's a very good question, because you always, just like with adults, you want to set the stage and set the purpose for learning, right? We buy into things quicker if we know why we're doing it. Students are the same way. So yes, goals are important, lesson goals are important for students to know, because they will buy into the lesson better because they'll know why they're doing it, okay? And once we get to the parts where it actually tells you those learning goals, then let's just make a note of that's what we noticed, and then we're making a connection, okay? All right, so after you've looked at your preview part, your understanding of what students should know is still not as clear yet as what it needs to be, okay? So you cannot stop at the preview page, because your job for 4th and 5th grade is to make sure that students are able to understand exactly what that standard is getting at and what that standard they have to master that standard, right? And mastering the standard connects to the assessments. So you need to know how all of that looks, okay? So you can't just stop at the preview page. You have to have a deeper understanding of that standard, the learning goals, and what students should understand from the lesson, okay? So here, as we went through the preview, I saw figurative language, okay? And I saw similes and metaphors in particular. So what I did from there was go to my unpacking document, and I looked through the document to find figurative language, similes, and metaphors, because I know that's what's coming in the lesson. So I want to make sure I have an understanding of what the standard says about figurative language, similes, and metaphors, so I can make sure that my students are getting exactly what they need to master this standard, okay? I do have a resource that I'm going to share with you guys later too that maps out the standards for each of the lessons, okay? So that will be helpful as well when you're trying to identify standards that you need to work with. All right, so as I was flipping through, I'm not going to give you guys the 66-page document for the unpacking document, because this standard was on page 65. So I gave you guys the page with that particular standard. So standard L 4.5, Ms. Cox, L is for language, okay? So the way the standards are written, you'll see an abbreviation, you'll see letters. You can see RI. RI is reading informational. So those are standards for informational text. You can also see RL, that's reading literature. Those are standards for literature, okay? Yes, ma'am. And you could see RF, that's reading foundation. You can also see, did you say SL? You can also see
Good afternoon,
SL.
HEAL family. At this time, we would like to dismiss all car riders to the media center doors to go home. Again, at this time, we would like to dismiss all car riders on this wonderful Friday to go home. Thank you and have a great day, everybody.
So you could also see SL for speaking and listening, but I will walk you through the unpacking document so you can see what those standards look like for each, okay? Because they'll be slightly different between the types of text that you're working with. So for this standard, it is a language standard. And one connection with looking at this, because it's not RI or RL, and in your lesson, it actually does say to students that authors can use this skill to explain complex information in both literature and informational text. And a lot of times when we teach figurative language, we teach it with literature, with texts that are made up because it's fun. Figurative language is fun to teach kids. But I think it's important, and I appreciate that with arts and letters, they are using it with an informational text to show students that we can still use the figurative language to explain some very complex information. Because in this lesson, they're learning about the heart. And they're making those connections, right? And that's setting them up for 5th grade. So Ms. Brodus is setting up your scholars for 5th grade science because they have to learn about the heart and different body systems and the circulatory system. So this is a very good segue to what they have to do in 5th grade, okay? Setting some good background knowledge. And I do appreciate that this was written this way. All right, so Standard L 4.5, demonstrate understandings of figurative language and nuances in word meanings. So we're looking to explain the meaning of simple similes and metaphors in context. Sounds familiar, right? Recognize and explain the meaning of common idioms, adages, and proverbs. Now, there may be idioms in the book, but when we look at our preview page, the focus is on those metaphors and similes. And sometimes, Ms. Cox, you will come to lessons that address parts of the standard because we chunk standards. We don't have to teach the whole standard at one time. We chunk standards to make them easy and more manageable for our scholars, okay? So this is an example of chunking a standard because there are 2 parts to this. But this lesson is focusing on similes and metaphors, okay? Now the clarification box is good to look at because you'll see examples of how it should look in a classroom. And this will help you make sure that as you're going through your lesson, you are addressing the standard. So the clarification box says that students show they understand figurative language and subtle differences in word meanings. Students determine the meaning of simple similes and metaphors from context. For example, as pretty as a picture. Students identify and explain the meaning of familiar idioms, adages, and proverbs. It has a glossary here, so you see definitions of each word, and you can make sure that it matches to, the language matches to what we have in our arts and letters manual.
Excuse me. So would we do that second part, seeing that this specifically says metaphors and similes? Would we do that at the same time? The B section of that part. Would we do that at the same time?
So for
Since we
this,
say we do it in chunks.
right.
Would we do that part at the same time?
So for this lesson, no, we would do it in chunks. The lesson focuses on similes and metaphors, and for this lesson, we will focus on similes and metaphors, okay? And this is really, some things stand out better in one subject area than another. When you are planning for math, that chunking of the standard, it stands out real bold because those standards are so complex, you have to chunk them. Well, reading, same thing, okay? You have to make sure that it's manageable for students, okay? And I don't want you having to pull, from resources when we have resources here. So if the lesson addresses similes and metaphors, that's the part you address for now. You just have to make sure you notate, and then once you get to the lessons that address the second part of the standard, then notate that has been addressed, okay? You just have to make sure that all parts of the standard are addressed by, the part and pacing that they should be, okay? All right, so in the classroom, this should look like the teacher teaching different types of figurative language using a shared text, which is what we'll be doing. The teacher giving students copies of the shared text with examples of similes, metaphors, idioms, adages, and proverbs. In our case, just similes and metaphors. Students highlighting examples in the text and annotating in the margins, which students will be doing throughout the lesson, what the figurative language means, and students sharing their annotations with partners. It can also look like teachers modeling how to identify and explain similes and metaphors by projecting text, highlighting similes or metaphors in the text, and students keeping track of similes and metaphors found in independent reading text on sticky notes or in their readers' notebooks. So this is not a non-negotiable. This is for you to have an idea of what it could look like in the classroom. Okay, if that makes sense. So once you have an understanding of what students should know and show, so here we know that students, by the end of this lesson, students should be able to have an understanding of what a simile and a metaphor is, okay? They should be able to identify and explain the meaning of similes and metaphors. Does that make sense? Okay. So now that I've gone through my preview page, I've gone through the unpacking document, the next step would be to look at what does this look like on an EOG assessment, or what does it look like on a classroom assessment, okay, or a benchmark assessment. So an example of this, a question that we could see for this particular standard that connects to the text could simply be, the author writes, the heart is like a divided highway. What is the most likely meaning of the comparison? So that is given a simile, and then it's asking for the scholars to determine the meaning, okay? And really, that's what the standard is asking for. So our questions and questioning to our scholars have to connect directly to the standard, okay? So explain the meaning of simple similes and metaphors in context. That question directly connects to the standard, okay? And they're understanding complex information. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. All right. So everybody okay so far? Okay, you still with me?
Yes,
All right.
ma'am.
All right, so now that we have gotten an understanding of what our students should know, remember, we always begin with the end in mind. Because if you know where you're taking your students, it makes it so much easier as you're teaching, because you can correct those misconceptions in the moment, because you know exactly what you want them to know. Okay, you know exactly what they need to master. You can also say some things during your lesson that will help lead and guide students to mastery of the standard, okay? So that's why it's important to start out with what that standard should look like at mastery. So unpack the standard. Look at the EOG assessments to find what similar questions on the assessments would look like, okay? All right, so now we're gonna move to step 2. So if you go back to your internalizing lesson plans document, what we're gonna look at now is the structure of the lesson. So we know our arts and letters lessons have 3 parts: the launch, learn, and land. What I would like to look at is, what is the goal of each part, okay? So we're still along the lines of goals, and I want you guys to look at the lesson that I copied for you on page 101. Let's look at the agenda. So the agenda gives you a quick synopsis of the goals of each part of the lesson, and it lays out the structure of the lesson for you. So here I see today's agenda, the launch, the goal.